I don't think dating apps are evil, but I do think they slowly mess with your brain in ways you don't notice until you're already kind of cooked. Because at first it's harmless. You download it out of boredom or curiosity, or because your friends convinced you, you make a profile, pick some pictures, write something that feels like you but also feels marketable, which is already weird if you think about it too long, and then you start swiping. At first it's exciting. Every match feels like a little hit of validation, like, okay, someone out there thinks I'm attractive, cool, nice, harmless, but then you realize how fast everything moves. You match with someone, you talk for a bit. They're funny, they seem interested, they ask questions, you think, okay, this one's different, and then they disappear. No explanation, no fight, no closure, just gone. And at first, you shrug it off. You tell yourself it's normal. People get busy. People lose interest. It's not personal, but when it keeps happening, you start internalizing it whether you want to or not. You start wondering if you said too much or not enough, if you replied too fast, too slow, if your joke didn't land, if your picture looks different in real life, if your vibe shifted, if you were too honest, too guarded, too available, too detached. And the worst part is, the apps give you infinite replacement options, so nothing ever gets processed. Someone ghosts you, swipe again. Conversation dies, swipe again. Date goes nowhere, swipe again. There's no pause, no reflection, just constant forward motion. I had this moment recently where I realized I was talking to 3 different people at once, having basically the same conversation with all of them. Same questions, same jokes, same energy, and I couldn't remember which detail belonged to which person. That scared me a little because I don't want to turn people into placeholders, and I don't want to be one either. I went on this one date where everything was fine, not bad, not amazing, just fine. And afterward, instead of thinking about how I felt around them, my first instinct was, okay, back to the app, let's see who else is out there. And that's when it hit me how dating apps train you to never sit with anything. Not disappointment, not confusion, not even potential. There's always the idea that something better is one swipe away, and that makes everyone disposable, including yourself. I also noticed how differently people show up on apps versus real life. Someone can seem emotionally available through text, thoughtful, attentive, interested, and then in person there's nothing. No presence, no curiosity, no effort. Or the opposite. Someone is dry as hell over text, barely engaging, and then in person they're warm and funny and real. And you start realizing how much of dating apps is just projection. You're not falling for the person, you're falling for who you think they might be. I caught myself doing that more than once, filling in gaps, making excuses, holding on to potential instead of reality. And then there's the burnout, the stage where opening the app feels like work, where you sigh before replying, where every hey feels exhausting, where you start ghosting people, not because they did anything wrong, but because you just don't have the energy to explain yourself again. That's when I knew I needed a break, because dating is supposed to be about connection, not optimization. And the apps slowly turn it into a numbers game. Who has better pictures? Who replies faster? Who stands out more in 3 seconds or less? It's hard to be human in a system designed for speed. I think the strangest part is how dating apps can make you feel both desired and disposable at the same time. Like, yes, people want you, but also you're one of hundreds, and that messes with your sense of worth if you're not careful. Sometimes you don't realize something isn't working until you keep ending up in the same spot. I don't think the answer is never using dating apps again, but I do think you have to use them intentionally. Know when to step back. Know when your nervous system is tired. Know when you're swiping out of boredom instead of genuine curiosity. Because if you don't, they'll quietly teach you to disconnect without even realizing it. It doesn't need to come with a swipe. And if not, that's fine too. Alright, that one had a lot of weight to it, but the next one is about to throw you for a loop. Ready for it? I knew this date was going to be bad before it even officially started, but for some reason I still went through with it, and that's on me. I don't know why I do this thing where I sense danger and go, let's see how bad it actually gets. So I met this guy on a dating app. We talked for a bit, nothing crazy, but enough that I thought, okay, he seems normal. A little awkward maybe, but that's fine. I can work with awkward. He wasn't overly flirty, didn't love bomb me, didn't say anything unhinged. Green flags by modern standards, honestly. We agreed to meet for coffee. Low commitment, easy exit if needed. That was intentional. intentional on my part because I've learned my lesson about dinner dates with strangers. I got there first, ordered my drink, and sat down. I was actually kind of calm. No nerves, no expectations, just neutral. And then he walked in. Immediately, something felt off. Not in a, he looks different from his pictures way. He looked fine. Exactly like his photos. It was his energy. He walked in like he was already annoyed to be there. No smile, no warmth, just straight face, scanning the room like he was doing me a favor by showing up. He sat down and didn't even say hi properly. Just, hey, and then immediately started talking about how hard it was to find parking and how he almost didn't come because traffic stressed him out. Which, okay, whatever. A bad start, but maybe he just had a rough drive. Then he started talking about himself. And I mean talking, no pauses, no questions, just a continuous stream of information about his job, his coworkers, how stupid his boss is, how much money he makes, how busy he is, how no one really understands how hard his life is. I nodded. I smiled. I waited for a question. None came. At some point, I tried to jump in and add something, literally just a small comment, and he talked over me. Not aggressively, just completely unaware that I had started speaking. That happened more than once. I started doing this thing where you stop fully engaging and just become an observer. Like you mentally take a step back and go, oh, this is one of those experiences. Then it got worse. He started talking about his ex, unprompted and not in a reflective way, in a resentful way, like he was still actively mad, but trying to disguise it as humor. He kept making little comments like, yeah, women always do that, or that's why I don't trust people anymore. And I'm just sitting there thinking, sir, you just met me. At one point, he actually said, I feel like I can be really honest with you, which is always terrifying on a first date. Then he told me he doesn't believe in therapy, thinks most mental health issues are exaggerated, and that people just need to be stronger. I think my soul left my body for a second. I tried to steer the conversation somewhere neutral, hobbies, music, anything. He said he doesn't really have hobbies because they're a waste of time unless they make money, which, okay. Then, and this is the part that truly sent me, he looked at me and said, you're quieter than I expected, as if that was my fault, as if I hadn't attempted to speak several times. I laughed it off because that's what I do when I'm uncomfortable, but inside I was already planning my escape. And then he asked me why I was single. I hate that question on a first date. Hate it. Because what answer are you expecting? A confession? A resume of my past relationships? A TED Talk? I gave a vague answer. Something normal. Something safe. He nodded and then said, yeah, I figured. Figured what? I didn't even ask. I didn't want to know. At that point, I checked the time and realized we'd only been there for maybe 35 minutes. It felt like 2 hours. I told him I had to leave soon because I had something to do later. He didn't acknowledge it, just kept talking. So I interrupted him, which I almost never do, and said, yeah, I should head out. He looked surprised, genuinely surprised, like the idea that I wasn't having the time of my life had not crossed his mind even once. Outside, he stood there awkwardly and said, we should do this again. Not asked, stated. I said something non-committal. He hugged me without asking and then walked away. I got in my car and just sat there for a minute, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what just happened. The worst part wasn't that he was rude or awkward. It was that he had absolutely no awareness, no curiosity, no interest in who I actually was. The date existed entirely for him. And I think that's what made it so draining. Later that night, he texted me and said he had a good time and would like to see me again. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish him or ghost out of spite. I just didn't have the energy to explain basic compatibility to someone who didn't. Even notice I barely spoke for an hour. And honestly, that date reminded me why I trust my gut now. Why I don't force myself to be nice when something feels wrong. Why I don't stay out of politeness. Some dates don't teach you what you want. They teach you what you absolutely don't. If you've ever sat in your car after a date and just gone, what the hell was that? Yeah, you get it. All right, that one was a lot to process, but the next story, it's got a twist that's definitely going to make you think. I want to talk about ghosting from the other side because I've been on both ends of it, and I feel like people only ever talk about how it feels to be ghosted, which is valid, don't get me wrong. That hurts. That sticks with you. That messes with your confidence, but being the one who ghosts someone is its own kind of uncomfortable, and I don't think people are always honest about why it happens. So here's mine. There was this person I was talking to for a while, nothing super intense but consistent. We texted pretty much every day. We'd talk about random stuff, send each other things we found funny, talk about work, life, all of that. It felt easy, comfortable, familiar, and I think that's part of the problem, because when something feels easy, you don't always stop to ask yourself if it actually feels right. At some point, I started noticing that I felt tired after talking to them, not drained in a dramatic way, just this low-level heaviness. Like, replying felt like a task instead of something I wanted to do. And I kept telling myself I was just busy, or overwhelmed, or overthinking. I kept responding anyway. That's how it always starts. They liked me more than I liked them. I could feel it. The way they checked in, the way they responded immediately, the way their messages carried a little more weight than mine did. And instead of addressing it early, like an adult, I avoided it because I didn't want to hurt them or make it awkward or have a heavy conversation when nothing was technically wrong. So I stayed half present, lukewarm, giving just enough to keep things going, but not enough to move them forward. And that's the part I don't feel great about. There wasn't one big moment where I decided to ghost. It wasn't intentional in the beginning. It was more like slow retreat. Replies got shorter, took longer. Conversations fizzled instead of flowed. I stopped initiating. I started hoping they'd lose interest on their own, so I wouldn't have to be the bad guy, which is cowardly. I know that. The final message they sent wasn't dramatic. That's what makes it worse. It was just something normal, a question, an attempt to keep the connection alive. I read it. I didn't know what to say. And instead of figuring it out, I put my phone down and told myself I'd reply later. Later turned into tomorrow. Tomorrow turned into guilt. Guilt turned into avoidance. And at some point, it felt like too much time had passed to respond without explanation. So I didn't respond at all. That silence wasn't peace. It was discomfort I chose not to deal with. And I think that's the part people don't like admitting. Sometimes ghosting isn't about cruelty. It's about conflict avoidance, emotional immaturity. Not knowing how to say, I don't feel this the way you do, and I don't want to keep pretending. I justified it to myself at the time. Told myself we weren't serious. Told myself they'd be fine. Told myself it was better than leading them on. But looking back, disappearing is leading someone on, just without words, because silence still sends a message. And usually, it's the worst one. What really gets me is knowing how confused they probably felt. Wondering if they did something wrong, replaying conversations, waiting for a reply that never came. I've been on that side before, and realizing I put someone else there doesn't feel great. I don't think every situation requires a long explanation or a dramatic goodbye, but I do think people deserve clarity when there's been consistency, when there's emotional investment, even if it's uncomfortable. I wish I had just said something simple, honest, kind. Something like, I don't feel the connection growing and I don't want to waste your time. That would have taken 2 minutes. Instead, I chose avoidance that probably lasted in their head a lot longer. I think ghosting says less about the person being ghosted and more about the ghoster's capacity for discomfort, for honesty, for holding space for an awkward moment instead of disappearing from it. I'm not proud of it, but I've learned from it. Now, when I feel myself pulling away, I try to pause and ask why. And if the answer is because this is hard, I try to say something instead of nothing. I'm not perfect at it, but I'm better than I was. Anyway, I just wanted to be honest about that side of things. Ghosting isn't always malicious, but it's rarely harmless. If you've ever been ghosted, I'm sorry. And if you've ever been the ghost, yeah, me too. All right, that was a bit of a gut punch, but now we're stepping into something different. Hold on, this next one is going to be an eye-opener. This one still makes me laugh a little, but only because enough time has passed that my nervous system has mostly recovered. So I matched with this person, and from the start, the vibe was odd? Not bad, just slightly off. Like when you hear a noise in your house at night and you tell yourself, it's probably nothing, even though you know it's something. They were funny, like genuinely funny. Quick replies, good banter, the kind of humor that makes you think, okay, at least they're not boring. And honestly, that alone will carry someone way further than it should. We moved off the app pretty quickly, which I normally hate, but again, threat detection system, broken. Almost immediately, the messages got intense. Not romantic exactly, just a lot. Long texts, rapid-fire thoughts, random voice notes sent at 2 a.m. with no context. They'd send something like, wait, I just had a thought, and then follow it with 5 paragraphs that clearly came from A far B. Completely different conversation happening only in their head. I should have dipped there, but instead I thought, okay, maybe they're just expressive. Then came the oversharing, and I don't mean normal getting to know you stuff. I mean deep family trauma, unresolved conflict, conflicts, grudges from 10 years ago, detailed stories about people who had wronged them and how unfair life had been, all within like 3 days. At one point, they said, "I don't usually open up like this, but something about you makes me feel like I can trust you," which is a sentence that should come with a warning label. They also kept telling me how rare I was, how people like me don't come around often, how they felt like meeting me wasn't an accident. I remember reading that and thinking, that's a lot of pressure for someone who doesn't know my middle name. Then we finally met in person, and oh my god, the energy shift was immediate. They were way more intense in real life, stood way too close, maintained eye contact for way too long, laughed a second too late at jokes, mirrored my posture in a way that felt rehearsed instead of natural. At one point, they said, "I feel like I've known you forever." We had been sitting together for maybe 20 minutes. They kept touching my arm when they talked, not aggressively, just constantly. Like every sentence needed physical emphasis. I kept subtly pulling away, and they kept subtly closing the gap. I ordered another drink just to have something to do with my hands. Then they started talking about the future. Not a future, our future. Trips we should take, things we'd do together, jokes about what kind of couple we'd be. All said casually, like it was obvious and already decided. My brain was screaming, but my mouth was doing that polite, smiling thing it does when it doesn't know how to escape yet. After the date, they texted me before I even got home, then again when I didn't reply immediately. Then sent a voice note saying they hoped I got home safe and that they were still buzzing from our connection. I replied something neutral, normal, human. That apparently unlocked something. The messages became constant. Good morning texts, good night texts, midday check-ins, comments about how long it had been since I replied, questions disguised as concern disguised as entitlement. If I took too long to respond, they'd say things like, "I hope I didn't scare you," or "I get anxious when people pull away." And listen, I'm empathetic, I really am, but there's a difference between being honest about anxiety and making it someone else's responsibility to manage it. I tried to slow it down, set boundaries, shorter replies, less engagement. They noticed immediately. They asked if I was losing interest. I said I just wanted to take things slow. They said they don't do slow because slow means abandonment. That sentence alone should have ended it. When I finally told them I didn't feel comfortable continuing, it did not go well. They sent multiple messages back to back, asking for reasons, arguing with my reasons, rewriting the timeline, telling me I misunderstood them, telling me I was projecting, telling me they just needed reassurance. Then they switched tones completely and said they respected my decision and wished me well. 5 minutes later, another message. "I just don't understand how you can feel nothing after what we shared." What we shared? Then they found me on another platform. And another. Not threatening, just there, watching, lurking, reacting to things. That's when I blocked them everywhere. And after that, I just sat there in silence, realizing how quickly things can go from quirky to why do I feel unsafe if you ignore your instincts. The wild part is, if you ask them, I'm sure they'd say they were just being honest, just being open, just being intense because they care deeply. But intensity without boundaries isn't romance, it's pressure, and pressure isn't connection. If you've ever thought, this feels like too much too fast, and stayed anyway, yeah, me too. That one really stayed with me, but trust me, the next story is a whole different vibe. Let's move on to this one. This one still makes my skin crawl, mostly because it didn't feel scary at the time. It felt convenient, and I think that's what bothers me the most now. So a while back, I started noticing how predictable my online life had become. Same apps, same routines, same scrolling patterns. Wake up, check my phone. Eat, check my phone. Bored, anxious, tired, happy, phone. Nothing unusual about that. Everyone does it. At some point, I started getting ads that were a little too specific, not in a funny way, not in a wow, that's accurate way, more like how would you even know that way? Stuff I hadn't searched, stuff I hadn't typed, things I'd only talked about out loud, usually casually, usually to myself. A thought about a product I might need, a random complaint about my sleep, a passing comment about a place I hadn't been to in years. I know the whole phones are listening thing sounds dramatic, and I'm not saying that's definitely what was happening, but the timing was always weird enough that it stuck with me. Then it got more personal. I'd think about messaging someone I hadn't talked to in a long time, and later that day, they'd show up in my people you may know section. Or I'd dream about someone, wake up, open an app, and see their post right at the top of my feed. Again, you can explain all of this logically. Algorithms, patterns, coincidences, I know that. But knowing the explanation doesn't stop the feeling. The feeling was that the internet knew me better than I knew myself, and not in a helpful way, in a quiet, invasive way. The worst part started when I noticed my phone reacting before I did. I'd feel anxious and my feed would immediately fill with calming content. I'd feel lonely, and suddenly I was seeing relationship videos, confessions, people talking about connection and longing. If I was angry, I'd see arguments, drama, outrage. It was like my emotions were being mirrored back at me before I even fully processed them. And slowly, without realizing it, I stopped asking myself how I felt. I'd open an app and let it tell me. There was one night that really stuck with me. I couldn't sleep, just lying there in the dark, scrolling aimlessly. I hadn't interacted with anything in a while, just watching. Suddenly, a video popped up that described almost word for word what I was feeling in that exact moment. Not broadly, specifically. The creator talked about being awake late at night, feeling disconnected, replaying old memories, feeling like time was slipping by. I remember freezing, staring at the screen, feeling this weird mix of comfort and unease. It felt like being seen and being watched. After that, I started paying closer attention. I noticed how certain thoughts didn't feel like mine anymore, how I'd suddenly want things I hadn't cared about before, how my mood could shift just by opening an app without anything actually happening in my real life. It scared me how easy it was, how little effort it took to guide my emotions, to keep me engaged, to keep me scrolling. At some point, I tried pulling back, turning off notifications, limiting screen time, and the apps reacted. Not literally, obviously, but the content changed. More urgent, more emotional, more don't look away. That's when it hit me. The internet doesn't want your attention. It wants your dependency. And dependency feels a lot like comfort at first. What really freaked me out was realizing how much of myself existed online without me actively choosing it. Old posts, old messages, old searches, versions of me that didn't exist anymore but were still being referenced, still being used to predict what I'd want next. It felt like being followed by ghosts of yourself. I remember deleting one app and feeling genuine anxiety, like I was cutting off a part of my awareness, like something important might happen and I wouldn't know about it. That's not normal, and it feels grounding in a way scrolling never did. There's no algorithm deciding what I should place next, no feedback loop, just me and my choices. Sometimes I wonder how much of who we think we are is actually just a reflection of what we're shown over and over again. How many thoughts feel spontaneous but aren't? How many fears are planted and watered quietly? This isn't a story with a jump scare or a villain you can point to. It's just the slow realization that something is always watching, learning, adjusting. Not because it cares, but because it works. And once you notice that, it's really hard to unnotice it. Anyway, some horrors don't chase you. They wait patiently for you to come back. Okay, so we've covered some heavy stuff, but this next one, it's a bit wilder, and I think it'll hit a little differently. So this happened during a country tour I did a while ago, and it's one of those stories that still feels a little unreal when I think back on it, mostly because it started in such a random, almost boring way. I was in a country where I didn't know anyone. Different language, different culture, different everything. I was staying in a small, cheap place, nothing fancy, just somewhere to sleep while I moved around. I didn't have a strict plan. I'd wake up, decide where to go that day, and figure it out as I went. One afternoon, I ended up in this small town that wasn't even on my original route. I missed a bus, got annoyed, and instead of waiting around, I just walked. No destination, just walking to kill time. That's when I met her. I was sitting outside a tiny cafe, mostly because it was the only place open, and I needed water. I was clearly a tourist. Camera bag, confused look, checking my phone every 5 seconds. She was sitting a few tables away, sketching in a notebook, headphones in, completely in her own world. At some point, she looked up and noticed me, struggling to read the menu. She took her headphones off and asked, in slightly broken English, if I needed help. I said yes immediately, probably a little too enthusiastically because I was tired and my brain was fried from translating everything all day. She laughed, helped me order, and then went back to her sketching. I thought that would be the end of it. But a few minutes later, she asked where I was from. That simple question turned into a conversation that lasted hours. She was traveling too, but in a completely different way. No rush, no checklist, no pressure to see everything. She'd been in that town for weeks, just living, working on her art, getting to know people. She knew everyone there. The cafe owner, the guy selling fruit down the street, the old woman who fed stray cats every morning. I remember feeling slightly embarrassed listening to her talk because she sounded so grounded compared to me. I was bouncing from place to place, trying to experience everything, and she was just existing. When the cafe closed, neither of us really wanted to leave, so we walked. No plan, no direction, just talking. We talked about everything, where we grew up, why we left home, what we were scared of, what we hadn't told anyone else. It didn't feel like meeting a stranger. It felt like continuing a conversation we'd paused somewhere else. That night, she invited me to join her and some local friends for dinner. I hesitated because I normally wouldn't do that. I'm not great with sudden plans or new groups of people, but something about her made it feel safe. Dinner turned into drinks. Drinks turned into stories. Stories turned into one of those nights where you forget to check the time. Over the next few days, we were inseparable. She showed me places I never would have found on my own. Not tourist spots, but quiet ones. A lookout point nobody talked about. A lake you had to walk an hour to reach. A bakery that only opened at dawn and sold out by mid-morning. We didn't rush anything. Some days we barely did anything at all. Just sat somewhere, talked, people watched, shared food. And the strange thing is, we never talked about how long we'd known each other, or what would happen when one of us left. We both knew the tour wouldn't last forever, but we didn't ruin it by naming the ending. On my last day in that town, we sat in the same cafe where we'd met, same table, same view. This time, the menu didn't matter. We didn't make promises to visit each other or swear we'd stay best friends forever. We just exchanged contact info, hugged for a long time, and said something like, "I'm really glad we met," and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything else on that trip. We still talk sometimes. Not every day, not even every month, but every now and then. One of us sends a message, and it's like no time has passed at all. I keep thinking about how strange it is that some of the most important people in your life don't come from careful planning. They come from missed buses, wrong turns, and random cafes you didn't even want to sit at. That trip gave me memories, photos, stories, but meeting her was the thing that stayed. Sometimes a country tour doesn't change your life because of the places you see. It changes your life because of the people you accidentally find. That was a heavy moment, but trust me, this next one is going to be a wild shift. Let's jump right in. This happened during that same country tour, and for a long time, I didn't even think of it as a bad story. It was just something that happened. It wasn't until much later, when I replayed it with more distance, that I realized how close it came to being something else entirely. I was moving between cities and ended up staying in this smaller town because everything nearby was booked. It wasn't somewhere I'd planned to stop, but at that point in the trip, I'd gotten used to improvising. The place I stayed was cheap, old, and run by a local family. It had that feeling of being lived in for decades, not updated, not polished, but not obviously sketchy either. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. No traffic, no nightlife, nothing. I remember thinking it would be a good place to rest for a couple days. The next morning, while I was having breakfast in the shared area, one of the other guests struck up a conversation with me. He was friendly in that effortless way some people have, like talking to strangers is second nature. He said he'd been traveling for years, moving slowly, working odd jobs, never staying in one place too long. At first, it felt comforting to talk to someone who understood that lifestyle. He asked where I'd been, where I was headed, what I was looking for from the trip. Normal questions, the kind you answer without thinking. He told me about a hiking trail outside town that wasn't marked on most maps, said it was one of the most beautiful places he'd seen in the country. Quiet, untouched, barely any tourists. He said he was planning to go that afternoon and invited me to come along. I hesitated. I don't usually go off alone with people I've just met, but he wasn't pushy. He didn't try to convince me. He just said, no pressure. Just thought I'd ask. That made it feel safer than it probably should have. I said yes. We set out after lunch, walking at first, then following a dirt path that led away from the town. The further we went, the quieter it got. No houses, no signs, just trees and uneven ground. I remember thinking it was beautiful, but also realizing how easy it would be to get lost out there. He talked a lot about his travels, his childhood, people he'd met along the way. Some of it was interesting, some of it felt rehearsed, like he'd told these stories many times before. At one point, I realized I hadn't said much in a while. Not because I didn't want to talk, but because every time I started, he would redirect the conversation back to himself. It was subtle but noticeable once I picked up on it. We stopped at a clearing to rest, and that's when the vibe shifted. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden aggression, no obvious threat, just small things that made my stomach tighten. He stood a little too close when we were talking. He asked more personal questions, not just surface level stuff, but things about whether I was traveling alone, whether anyone knew exactly where I was that day, how long I planned to stay in town. I answered vaguely, suddenly very aware of my words. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I'd been consuming too many true crime stories, that this was just an awkward moment. Then he suggested we take a different path back. One, he said, was faster. I looked around and realized I didn't recognize anything anymore. No clear trail, no landmarks I could confidently identify. That's when my body reacted before my brain fully caught up. My heart rate picked up. My thoughts got sharp and focused in a way they hadn't been all day. I suddenly didn't care about being polite or chill or agreeable. I said I was tired and wanted to head back the same way we came. He paused, just for a second, and in that pause, something changed in his expression. Not anger, not disappointment, just calculation. He smiled and said, "Yeah, sure, if that makes you more comfortable." That sentence stuck with me. The walk. Back felt longer than it should have. He talked less. I talked more than I wanted to, filling the silence, trying to keep things light. I kept my phone in my hand, pretending to check the map, even though I was really just grounding myself. When we finally reached the edge of town, the tension in my body released so fast, it almost made me dizzy. We said goodbye like nothing strange had happened. Back at the place I was staying, I locked my door and just sat there for a while, replaying everything, trying to figure out if I was being dramatic or if something genuinely hadn't felt right. The next morning, he was gone. No goodbye, no message, no mention from the hosts, just gone. I left that town earlier than planned. Nothing happened to me. That's the thing. There's no big reveal, no proof that anything bad was going to happen. But I learned something important that day. Danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as a feeling you can't explain, a moment where your instincts start whispering before your brain is ready to listen. And I still think about that walk sometimes, about how easy it would have been to ignore that feeling and keep going. I didn't have a reason to leave. I just had a sense that I should. And honestly, that was enough. Some trips give you stories you love telling. Others give you stories you're just grateful ended when they did.